Okay. Thank you, Rosie. I'm James McConnell from Northumbria University, and it's my pleasure to be welcoming Professor Marie Coleman from Queen's University Belfast, who's going to be speaking to us this evening. Marie is based, as I've said, at Queen's, and she's a historian of 20th century Irish history, particularly the Irish Revolution. Her recent research is focused on the award of pensions and compensation during and after the revolution, on gender history, on commemoration, and as I know from some recent work, working on environmental histories of the Irish Revolution. Her first book was a history of County Longford during the Revolution. Then she wrote a very interesting book about the Irish sweepstakes over a longer period. And then recently she's written a very useful book about the Irish Revolution itself, which is a really useful way to get into the topic for those of you who are interested. She's joint editor of Irish Historical Studies, the leading Irish history journal in the field, and has also been a member of a variety of sort of important committees connected with the ongoing decade of centenaries. This evening, she's going to be sharing with us some of her research in progress on a fascinating and controversial topic to do with Crown forces in Ireland, and specifically the Black and Tans. So I'll hand over to Marie.
Thank you very much, James, and good evening, everybody. And thank you, so many of you, for tuning in tonight. It's just a great pity I can't be in Newcastle in person, so I'm opening myself to accept an in-person invitation when things return to somewhere near normal. So I'm going to start sharing my screen now, because you won't want to look at my talking head for the next half an hour or however long this talk lasts. So I'll just go to slideshow. Okay, as James was saying there, this research, I suppose that the immediate impetus for this research was the controversy over the non-commemoration of the RIC in Southern Ireland in January 2020. And I want to touch on that at the end, but I'm quite happy to go into more detail in that particular discussion in Q&A if people would like to engage with it in a bit more detail. But when that controversy all started up in January 2020, I was about to start a period of research leave. And I thought back to my own research, which, as James said, was initially on County Longford. And I had spent a lot of time going through various census records and other things to put together a picture of the men who made up the revolutionary IRA and the women who made up Cumann na mBan. And I realized that I had never really done the same for their adversaries on the Crown Force side. So I started with taking a small cohort, which is a group of auxiliaries who were ambushed in Longford in February 21. There were just 19 of them on that day. And I've started with them as my cohort. So they'll figure tonight. The work is ongoing with various lockdowns and restrictions and other work commitments. I haven't been able to advance it as well as I would like to, but I think this talks like this are very useful opportunities for me to get some feedback on where the research is going. So tonight there are really three layers to my discussion. I want to look first at the overall picture of policing in revolutionary Ireland, and it's a complex one made up of lots of different organisations. And then I want to narrow my focus to these groups, the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries, and to that particular cohort of the 19 members of the auxiliary division of the RIC who were ambushed at Clonfin in County Longford in February 1921. And then I want to narrow it further to give a bit of local colour and to focus on one of those auxiliaries who was killed in that ambush and who has links to the Greater Tynemouth area. So I think he's in the research anyway, but given the location of the talk tonight, I thought it would add a nice bit of local colour. And then I'll finish up by talking about the controversy over the RIC commemoration. So just to start briefly, and in fact, James and myself were laughing at the outset about whether or not the ill-fated 2020 commemoration of the RIC could ever take place in Southern Ireland. And we've come up with a wonderful solution that we'll just hold on 16 years, and in 2036 we can propose a commemoration of the bicentenary of the foundation of the original Irish Constabulary in 1836. So policing, the origins of the RIC go back to that organisation. The title of Royal was added in 1867 in recognition of their role in suppressing the Fenian uprising. The RIC was the police force for all of Ireland except Dublin City. In contrast to something like the modern Garda Síochána in the Republic of Ireland, there were an armed police force. And I think in 21 and 22, a decision was made that the Garda Síochána would be very different from the RIC, and that was one of the ways in which they were marked out as being different. In terms of the personnel of the RIC, as they were recruited internally within Ireland, it's not much of a surprise that the majority of the force was Catholic, but at the upper echelons of officer and inspector and district inspector, there did tend to be a disproportionate representation of Protestants. For many years, in the mid to late 19th century, joining the RIC was seen as a respectable job for middle-class, lower middle-class Catholic men and a way of advancing. From the British perspective, they were probably the most visible and the most useful source for the British administration in Ireland of life in Ireland. If anybody has read the monthly reports which RIC county inspectors sent back to the Inspector General of the RIC in Dublin Castle, they will know just how useful of a source they are, at least until 1920, of what's going on the ground in Ireland. I mentioned that the RIC was the police force for most of Ireland, except Dublin City, which had its own police force, the Dublin Metropolitan Police. The rank and file were unarmed constables, memorably in David Fitzpatrick's wonderful phrase during the revolutionary period, he likens them to not being up to much more than being glorified traffic wardens. But they also had a much more significant aspect, their intelligence division, G division of the Dublin Metropolitan Police, then based in what would have been called Great Brunswick Street Station. It's now Pierce Station, the Garda station opposite the side of Trinity College, along by the Lewis, if anybody is familiar with Dublin. So this is one of the first points I want to make, is the multiplicity of police forces operating in Ireland during the revolutionary period. So we start 1919, we've got what's been there for nearly a century, the RIC and the DMP. But once the revolution really took off in 1919, life got very difficult for the RIC. The newly established Dáil decreed a boycott of the RIC, and particularly from January 1920 onwards, the focus of the IRA's guerrilla campaign during the War of Independence was on targeting RIC barracks. Part of it was to drive the RIC out, another part of it was to capture their arms. I don't need to go into it in great detail, but the map I have here, which is taken from that compendium, the Atlas of the Irish Revolution, just gives you an idea how many small little policing outposts there were in Ireland until the end of 1919. And then as things heated up in 1919, the British realized that a lot of these small police outposts with maybe one or two constables were a danger, that they were a target for Republican violence. So there's a consolidation of the RIC into these larger barracks by 1920. And like I say, just the dots on the map there are illustrative of that in itself. The reason the IRA, really from January 1920, it's almost a change overnight as IRA General Headquarters instruct local IRA units to attack the RIC barracks. The first thing they do is attack all the small little outposts which were vacated at the end of 1919, but they proceed to assaulting occupied barracks, as I said, partly to get the guns and partly to try and intimidate the RIC. And at the heart of that was an effort to convince many Irish RIC men to leave the force. In addition to the Dáil boycott, which decreed such things as having absolutely no contact with the RIC or their families either. So people were, shopkeepers were advised not to serve the the family of RIC members. If we look at a report prepared by the British Labour Party Commission when they visited Ireland in 1920 to get a handle on the violence that was going on there, they identify RIC men's wives and families as being among one of the categories of women in particular who experienced a lot of violence and intimidation during this period. So there's a very strong campaign against the RIC. The RIC are shunned, they're physically assaulted, their barracks are physically attacked. And that all starts to take effect by early 1920 and particularly by the summer of 1920. By the summer of 1920, the RIC is losing significant personnel through retirements or resignations or even dismissals of those who are not seen as loyal because possibly they're not prepared to carry out the orders which they are unhappy carrying out to take action against their fellow countrymen. So there's a serious personnel deficit in the RIC by the summer of 1920. The answer to that on the British side is to bolster the RIC with two adjunct police forces. The first of these, introduced in January 1920, was an integral part of the force. It was just an add-on to try and bolster the numbers. These were the organisation which very quickly became known as the Black and Tans because of the mismatch of uniforms made up of a combination of leftover army khaki and the dark bottle green tunic of the RIC, which at a distance was so dark green it looked almost black. So these men were recruited in England, mostly in England, but the more you look at records, the more you realise just how many Irish men and how many Catholic Irish men were still joining the RIC after January of 1920. And I think that's an aspect of research on revolutionary policing in Ireland that needs a lot more focus. So these were brought in as constables in the police force. Now, growing up, I would have heard from older generations in Ireland, and I'm sure my late grandfather would have subscribed to this notion that the Black and Tans were nothing more than the sweepings of the British prisons, that they were half crazed, half drunken ex-convicts. And if they weren't ex-convicts, they were ex-servicemen who were whose mental health had been seriously affected by their wartime service. There is very little evidence to sustain either of those contentions, but particularly the first one. There's very little evidence that any of these men had criminal records. The first lot of RIC were recruited from January 1920, but the ongoing depletion of personnel in the RIC made the British have to come up with a second idea to bolster the personnel of the RIC, and that's where we get this idea of the auxiliary division of the RIC. Now, the Black and Tans were recruited largely from ex-servicemen, and they tended to be ex-servicemen who had served in the other ranks, in the non-commissioned ranks of the army. The auxiliary division, by contrast, there was an effort to paint this as a much more elite force, and there was deliberate aim to recruit those who had served in the officer corps during the First World War. They were separate. They also had, there were a little, I suppose, an independent republic within the RIC, whereas the Black and Tans were part of the overall RIC structure. The auxiliaries were a law unto themselves within the RIC. They had their own command structure, and they just were, while they are called the auxiliary division of the RIC, they were somewhat apart from it. They were very much designed as a mobile force in the context of guerrilla warfare in Ireland at the time. The idea was that these men would come in their Crossley tenders or whatever, and they would travel around the country, rooting out the RIC from, or the IRA from wherever they were holed up. So there's a very deliberate effort to make them a mobile force. When we think about the backgrounds of these men, both the RIC, the Tans and the auxiliaries, all had First World War service of some sort. Maybe the idea was that these are military men, they'll know what they're doing in Ireland. There's absolutely no way that their war experience could have been remotely suitable for the context of the guerrilla warfare conditions they found in Ireland in 1920 and 21. And I think as I go on to talk about the cohort I want to study, we will see that very clearly. Another point to make is the utter inadequacy of their training on arrival. At the start, those who arrived earlier in January 1920, maybe up to the summer of 1920, seem to have got some level of training in the Phoenix Park Depot in Dublin before they were deployed throughout the country. But the men I'm going to look at, most of whom who joined in December 1920, they joined up one day and they were sent along for the next day with absolutely no training or no sense of what they were going to face in Ireland. And as if this isn't complicated enough, that we've got the RIC and the DMP, and then we've got the Black and Tans, and then we've got the auxiliaries. We had yet another police force brought into Ireland in 1920, in this case, specifically in Ulster, the Ulster Special Constabulary, made up of the A, B, and C specials, established in the autumn of 1920, specifically to deal with the sectarian violence in Ulster. This was an exclusively Protestant force. With all things in Northern Ireland, if you mention the B specials to people on different sides of the community, you get two contrasting versions. To the Protestant side, or the Unionist side at least, they have the reputation as being defenders of unionism and Protestantism against the Republican campaign, which was gaining some force in Ulster as 1920 went on. To the Catholic and the Nationalist side, there were vigilantes responsible for sectarian attacks on Catholics. And that's a reputation that stayed particularly with the B specials. And if we move to the civil rights period of the late 60s and the early 70s, one of the demands for civil rights and one of the demands of Catholics and Nationalists is the disbandment of the B specials, which eventually happened in that context in the 1970s. Now, the B specials are an organization which still need a lot of looking into. Chris McGill's recent book on them in the context just of Antrim would suggest that some of what we have taken for granted about their background, that they were all pre-war UVF and that they were all had wartime service with the 36th Ulster Division, might not be as accurate. What he has seen, to the extent that he's been able to access some personnel records, it would suggest that maybe some of them were too young to have had much service in the pre-war UVF, because we're talking, say, 7 years after the establishment of the UVF. Now, one thing we are trying to do here, a group of academics, James mentioned a number of committees I'm sitting on. One of those is let me get the title of this right, the Centenary Historical Advisory Panel, which is the wonderful acronym of the CHAPS. And we are the panel which advises the Northern Ireland office, or has for this past year, on the historical aspects of the centenary of Northern Ireland. We take no credit or blame for any of the other things. We just talk about the history. One of the things we have been trying to do is work with the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland to ensure the release of the personnel records and any other records relating to the Ulster Special Constabulary, because there are personnel records. So the sort of thing that I am going to be showing you that I'm doing with the TANs and the auxiliaries is something that I would very much like to do with the B specials, to try and start tracing these people. What age were they? Where did they come from? Can we get any sense of what their family background and their occupational background was? So I'm not going to dwell on the B specials, but just to mention them as yet another of this multiplicity of police forces operating in Ireland in the revolutionary period. But that's just the policing. We tend to use the term Crown Forces in Ireland during this period, and I think you're probably beginning to see why it's a useful catch-all term, because there are so many different forces of the Crown. But in addition to all of these police forces, we of course have the army as well. From 1920, led by this man here in the slide, who didn't have a very high opinion of Irish people, General Sir Neville Macready. When Macready was appointed as GOC of the army in Ireland in 1920, he was asked to take over responsibility for policing instead, and probably very wisely from his perspective refused to do so, because he wasn't going to be associated with the reputation of what the police forces were doing in Ireland. But from the British administrative perspective, it was a weakness, because basically what you have here is a classic too many coups. You have too many different police forces under different authorities, and you have an overall failure to have unified control of the Crown forces. So it's a bit of a hodgepodge as regards policing in revolutionary Ireland. So that's kind of the first point I wanted to make, that there's so many different people doing different things at the time, and that a lack of unified purpose and unified control. So let's now move on to the next part, where I want to look in a bit more detail at the TANs and auxiliaries. And one of the questions which historians of the Irish Revolution have been asking themselves for about 40 years is, why did young men join the IRA, and having done so, why did they take up arms against British rule in Ireland? We have not asked that question to the same extent of their adversaries. Recent work by David Leeson, by Andrew Nelson, a recent PhD graduate of Northumbria, has started to ask that question. It's a question that we are able to find the answer to because of recent releases of war records in the National Archives in London, but also the digitization of all those census records for England and Wales and Scotland on sites like Ancestry and Find My Past. And even digitization of newspapers makes it much easier to find details about these men. So this is sort of where my research is going at the moment, and where I want to try and do a little bit more. So let's tease out this question a bit of what was the motivation for these men, these largely English, some Welsh and Scots, and indeed some Irish men, who joined the TANs and the auxiliaries. Very often they were portrayed as mercenaries because they were very well paid. They were much better paid, say, than senior ranks of the London Metropolitan Police. So definitely there was a financial incentive there. Given the economic downturn in Britain after the war and the difficulty many of these ex-servicemen had, not only in readjusting to civilian life, but even basics, finding employment, finding housing, it's not too surprising that when the opportunity of a well-paid job came along, that they took it. Some of them also had pre-war policing careers or had been in the armed forces before the war. So maybe it was it was the one thing that they knew how to do. So maybe that partly explains some of it. The dislocation of the war, 4 years of spending your life alongside other men, built up a level of camaraderie that was suddenly taken away when they came home in 1919. Here was an opportunity to experience that again. There may be something in that also. We also know that a number of them, that sense of dislocation and what to do next continued after their Irish experience, and many of them ended up serving in police forces in Palestine. Many of them sought transfer to police forces in other parts of the Dominions, but they weren't all that welcome because of their reputation of what had happened in Ireland. There is some quite good research on that side of it. So I've put up there on the slide one of the advertisements for the auxiliary division in particular, and you can see it's a corps d'élite. This is an elite corps, so you're joining something important. It makes you feel important. Ex-officers with a first-class record, men of courage, distinction, tact, judgment. We'll pay you £1 a day. We'll give you a free uniform. You'll get leave and pay. Why wouldn't you join the auxiliary division when it was so wonderful, as this advertisement suggests? So I think there's a lot of layers to peel back there on exploring personal motivation for joining. So the group, I want to bring this down now to the layers, from the overall policing layers to the individual forces and to groups, and eventually to one individual. So the group I want to look at are a group of 19 men who are part of M Company of the Auxiliary Division of the RIC, who were stationed in the infirmary in Longford town. They were sent there in December 1920 because the guerrilla campaign had heated up quite considerably in Longford in November 1920. There's a very good website, I've just given it there, theauxiliaries.com, has excellent information on individual members of the auxiliaries and details. So it's, if anyone's interested in looking up a bit more about them, that is a truly excellent and freely available website. Well, the 19 men I want to look at were ambushed by the North Longford flying column of the IRA on a back road between the village of Ballinolea and the town of Granard on the 2nd of February 1921. Now, there's a picture there of the ambush site as it is today, because it's been done up quite nicely by Longford County Council for the centenary. But the older picture there, which I admit is a bit blurred, but you can see two figures standing, and then you can see a third figure who seems to be a good head smaller than them. He's not actually smaller, but he is standing in a crater created by a mine, a homemade mine, which was made by local blacksmiths and basically dug into the road. And as the RIC approached this site, as the auxiliaries approached this site, the bomb was detonated and their first Crossley tender was stopped. There were 2 Crossley tenders altogether, 19 men. And if you can't really see it there from the other side, but you can see there's a lot of trees and there's some high ground there as well. The IRA were very cleverly positioned around this site. In many ways, it is one of the most ideal ambush sites of the Revolutionary IRA during the War of Independence. And those 2 Crossley tenders of auxiliaries were absolute sitting ducks when they were stopped on that road with absolutely no cover, and up to 20 men shooting at them from behind trees and from concealed positions behind hedges and ditches. So it's no surprise to learn that 4 of them died in the assault. In fact, it's probably somewhat surprising that more didn't. And there's an interesting contrast here with Kilmichael, because when they surrendered, I think they felt they were going to. Reading some of their after incident reports, they asked the IRA leader, Sean McKeown, was he going to do away with them? Now, he didn't do so. He allowed them to deal with their wounded and to give medical assistance to their wounded. In fact, he let them do it for so long, he nearly ended up having his own men captured by reinforcements who were arriving from Granard. But so these men most of the men, apart from 4 who were killed, have survived, unlike Kilmichael. So we have a bit more information about the ambush because the survivors gave their accounts of it. Well, I started looking, one of my last research trips to an archive ever before COVID hit us in March 2020. I was in the UK National Archives in Kew in mid-March of 2020, looking at the war records of the 19 Clonfin auxiliaries, and using those and using census records and various other things. This is just a snapshot. It may not be reflective of the overall auxiliary force, but I think it's a good starting point. The majority of them are English, 14 of them are English, 2 were Scottish. There was 1 Welshman, 1 Irishman, and I want to say a bit about that. And then there was 1 very exotic South African who had served on the Boer side during the Boer War. He was fairly young at the time, so he was probably a messenger. He went on then to have a career as, he had 3rd level education, so quite rare among this group, I would think. He went on then to be a teacher of Afrikaans in an English boys' school in South Africa. He left that to train as a preacher in the Dutch Reformed Church. When the First World War broke out, he joined the South African forces supporting the British. So having been fighting against the British 20 years previously in the Boer War, he was now on side with them. And then he moved to England about 1915 or 16 to join the RAF. And he ends up in the auxiliary division. In a compensation claim he put in, he said, well, he thought he joined up because he thought something might come of it. But another record I found suggested that he got divorced in the summer of 1921. So possibly there was a desire to leave behind an unsatisfactory relationship. But my overall cohort here, the average age is about 26, which doesn't make them a whole lot different from the Revolutionary IRA. The majority were Protestants of different denominations. There was 1 Catholic in this group who was one of the Scottish men. What's significant here is how little time they had spent in Ireland, and particularly Longford at the time. 13 of them had come in December 1920, and most came after Christmas, and 3 had come in January 1921. So this was the 2nd of February 1921. They weren't in the place 6 weeks. So they had barely had time to get their bearings. And here they were traveling around the place, these back roads in rural Ireland in the middle of the winter, very far flung from their First World War experience. Obviously, all of them had pre-war service or wartime service, because that was a prerequisite. Most in the army, quite a number in the Air Force. Again, the Air Force wasn't much use for guerrilla warfare in Longford in 1921, and 2 in the Navy. I mentioned before that 4 of these men were killed, 3 at the scene, and 1 2 days later in hospital died of his wounds. 8 more were wounded, and many of them never went back into service. 7 were uninjured. In total, if I take this group and bring them up to the time the RIC were disbanded in 1922, only 5 of these 19 men were still left in the force. And that gives us a sense, some of the others were injured in different engagements, but it gives you a sense of just how high the attrition rate in the auxiliaries were. And I think it's hard to get away from David Leeson's conclusion that in the end, the auxiliaries were a very expensive failure. One thing I mentioned earlier, the slightly different class differences between the TANs and the auxiliaries. Because the auxiliaries were recruited from the officer corps during the war, there's always been this perception that somehow they were of a higher class, that in the class structure, they came from maybe the more upper echelons of society. When we look at these men in more detail, there isn't much evidence to sustain that. Yes, they were officers, but most of the ones I'm looking at least, were temporarily commissioned as officers towards the end of the war, when there was a very high attrition rate within the army. Using census records and using their own attestation papers and various other documents, we get a sense of their pre-war occupations and also their parents' occupations. Of my 19, 4 had some form of pre-war military service. A number of them were involved in mechanics and engineering. That seems to have been quite a popular one. And given that the auxiliaries was a mobile police force driving around in tenders, I suppose that's not hugely surprising. Some of them had clerical works, other occupations, and some of them had more than one occupations, but I've come across a few who worked in agriculture, a spinner, a butcher, a messenger. My teacher and preacher is the same South African. One man was an actor, and the South African, again, was the only one to have a tertiary education. Looking through their parents' occupations would tend to reinforce that view that these men were not necessarily from the upper echelons of society, but from maybe the skilled working class, lower middle class. So this sense of them as being a social elite force, I don't think, from what I've seen so far, maybe isn't standing up to scrutiny. Now, I haven't maybe looked at enough of them yet, but I think it's certainly a conception about the RIC that we might have to, about the auxiliaries, that we might have to question. Only 3 of my 19 had parents with sort of professional occupations. One of them, his father was a doctor, and one was a lawyer, and one whose mother, a widow by the time she was widowed when the auxiliary in question was quite young, she was a teacher. The majority of the parents seemed to work in retail, many in skilled trades, manufacturing, labouring, engineering, and one in farming. So not any sort of social elite emerging from the family backgrounds of my auxiliaries, at least. Now, I want to focus on one man in particular, and this is where the local focus, where I'm moving from the sort of national picture to the regional picture in Longford to the individual focus of one man who has links to the north of England. And this is Harold Clayton, one of the fatalities of the Clonfin ambush. He was the one who died a few days later. So Clayton was born in Keighley, I'm told that's how it's pronounced, in Yorkshire in 1896. And he was killed at Clonfin. The census of I know that the images here probably aren't terribly clear, but the census record for 1911, which is up there, I think that's 1911, or I'm not sure if that's 1911 or 1901. It's no, it'd be 1901 because he's 4 at that. So you see his father there, Samuel Clayton, Sarah, and then there's Isaac, and I actually can't read it myself from here, but the family entry in the census record gives us just a sense of that, reinforces that sense that this isn't a family who are terribly well off. They're probably comfortable, but they're definitely not, wouldn't be having huge numbers of family servants in the house or anything like that. In the 1911 census, he himself is listed as a spinner, and his army war service, he was in the Territorial Army before the war broke out in the Duke of Wellington's regiment, and almost the day war breaks out, 4th of August 1914, there we have him rushing to join the regular army to see service. He is quite a colourful, I suppose, or at least an eventful army career. He was first wounded at Ypres in 1915, back into action and wounded at the Somme in October 1916, and out for the best part of a year. Now, you might think at that point that would be enough for anybody not want to be seeing too much more service, but obviously he was sent back in, and he wasn't back long when he was gassed in 1917. So he was eventually demobilized and moved to the reserves at the end of the war in January 1919. Now, you would think that that would be plenty of conflict for anybody to have seen. I mean, why would anybody who had such a wartime experience want to go anywhere near being shot at by the IRA in rural Ireland in 1921? So this is where it gets a bit more interesting. And this wonderful photo of Clayton and his wife, I discovered recently on that wonderful site, Lives of the First World War, where people, at a kind of a crowdsourcing site where people can put up their own records. So before the war ended in 1918, he married to a lady called Eleanor Graham Hyde, and their son, their first child, Harold, was born in 1919. I looked up his funeral notice in the South Shields Daily News for 1921, and that gave me just a few little snippets, but which really give me colour to this. It said that because of the shortage of post-war housing, so we're already getting a sense of the difficulties of facing ex-servicemen in post-war Britain. So because of that shortage of housing, himself and his wife, and presumably Harold Jr., moved in with his father-in-law in Cullercoats up from Tynemouth. And he had various jobs after the war, first as the manager of a labour exchange, and then employee. It doesn't say what he did, with a company called Brim and Company Contractors, who, if they're the company that's still in existence today, I gather are building contractors. So he eventually joined the auxiliary division 4 days after Christmas in 1921. So some of this has to be supposition, but this looks like a classic example of a man trying to provide for his family in the post-war circumstances. He was at least able to get employment, but the fact that he's moving between jobs suggests it's fairly short-term employment. I don't know what the pay for a manager of a labour exchange in 1919 or 20 would have been, but it would be interesting for me to find out to make a comparison. But if we look at some of the evidence which his wife gave, some evidence in a compensation claim talking about the money he was sending back to the family, and given that he had, at the time of his death, he had one young son and their second child was on the way, it's hard to escape the conclusion that this man joined the auxiliary division of the RIC because he had military experience and he was looking for a good way to provide for his family who couldn't even find their own house to live in. So Clayton was badly injured about 5-6 weeks after arriving in Ireland. He was badly injured in the Clonfin ambush. He was taken to Dr. Stevens's hospital in Dublin, where he died on the 4th of February. His body was returned to the north of England, and he was buried in Preston Cemetery in Tynemouth on the 9th of February 1921, and his gravestone is still there today as part of it. There's a section of the cemetery, I understand, dedicated to ex-servicemen. Now, interesting, I was looking at the Tynemouth War Memorial online, and his name doesn't appear there, because I know some war memorials have added ex-servicemen who were killed in the Irish War of Independence, even though it postdates the dates of the First World War, but he's not one of them. Following his death in the summer of 1921, his second child, his daughter Mary, was born, and at the quarter sessions in Longford in October 1921, his family, his wife and dependents were awarded £3,500 compensation, which was eventually paid to them by the British government. So I want to, the last point I want to touch on, and we can, as I say, I'm happy to talk about it in a bit more detail in the Q&A afterwards, is why the RIC remains so, and the black and tans remain so controversial. And I liked doing these with students a few times. Unsuspecting multinational companies have fallen foul of their association with the black and tans. The ice cream makers, Ben and Jerry's, got into trouble for suggesting a black and tan flavor, I suppose, some sort of takeoff on the alcoholic drink. Nike, unfortunate timing for them, around St. Patrick's Day a couple of years ago, decided they would produce a black and tan sneaker. That didn't last very long. This is why you need to hire history graduates in multinational companies. But if anyone recalls back to 2007, when Lansdowne Road was being redeveloped in Dublin and the Irish international rugby team was playing its international matches in the headquarters of the GA in Croke Park, there was an element of controversy about the playing of God Save the Queen in Croke Park because of its association with the black and tan reprisal there in November 1920. And likewise, when Her Majesty the Queen had her state visit to the Republic of Ireland 10 years ago, Croke Park was one of the sites which she visited. And again, there was mild controversy about that. But in some ways, I think what was interesting about it is that neither of those two latter events were as controversial as they might have been some years previously. Well, of course, the most controversial event in recent years surrounding the memory of the RIC was this decision, or whether it's decision or whatever it was, by elements within the Irish government that they would run a commemorative event for the RIC in January 1920. Now, this immediately fell foul of certain politicians, which of course had nothing at all to do with the fact that there was a general election coming up in Ireland in the spring of 1920. But part of it, in some ways, the government let themselves in for this, because the timing of it, they said, oh, it's nothing to do with the black and tans and the auxiliaries. We're just commemorating the RIC and the police force for so long, and so many Irish people had members in it, and it's coming up to the centenary of their disbandment, so we'll commemorate it. And you're going, right, so they were disbanded in 1922, so why didn't you wait till 2022 to commemorate them? Why did you decide to commemorate them in January 2020, which just happens to be the centenary of the introduction of the black and tans? So this was so badly thought out in so many ways, but the timing was brutal. Associating it with January, having it in January 2020, which was exactly 100 years since the black and tans were brought in to bolster the RIC, it was inevitable that that link was going to happen. So I think maybe one beneficial side effect of it from the academic perspective was that it did get us talking, and there's a variety of talks online and radio shows and blogs and things where people started to delve into the actual history of the relationship between the regular RIC and the TANs and the auxiliaries, and start to look at this question a bit more of what I have tried to address tonight, of who were the black and tans and the auxiliaries. So I'll leave it there, and I'm quite happy to, I'll stop the screen share so you can see me again in full, and I'm quite happy to take any questions, either, as Rosie said, if she wants to relay anything that's written in the text, or if anyone wants to come in on screen and put a direct question. I'm quite happy to try and answer any of them.
I should just say we're also joined here by, you can see him, Dr. Conal Parr, my colleague from Northumbria University, who's a historian of the 20th century Ireland as well. Thanks, Marie. That was really interesting. A really useful sort of going from the big picture and then drilling down into one particular sort of group and one particular ambush, and then even further into a local example to give us a sort of sense of different sort of scales there. So I know that there is one question from Paul Nugent that was posted, who says he has a question about some black and tans going to Palestine and other outposts of empire after Ireland. Would you like to say a little bit about that?
Well, part of the problem was when the RIC was disbanded in 22, the British were left with this problem. What do we do? Not only are they ex-servicemen, we need to find something to do with. They're now ex-policemen from Ireland who have a terrible reputation. So what will we do with them? I have to admit, I haven't looked in a huge detail into this, but Sean Gannon's work on specifically on the RIC who went to Palestine is well worth looking at. So even Sean's book is published by Palgrave. I know the book itself is expensive enough, but if you just Google any of Sean's work, he's a fair bit out there in the public domain. So he can say much more about it. One thing I do know, one of my Longford Black and Tans, a man called Clemens, who it's alleged was some relation of Mark Twain, but I think the judge in the compensation claim in the court might have been just making that up. But he Black and Tan in Longford, and he went to Palestine and he committed suicide in Palestine. So there's a whole, there is a whole question opening up there about the impact of war service and of Irish service on these men afterwards, and to what extent they suffered traumatic experience in the war, or whether that was compounded by what happened in Ireland, and maybe Palestine just didn't know what to do with themselves, and Palestine was an obvious place. I also know there were efforts to resettle them. The ex-RIC and ex-auxiliaries were a bit of a problem for the British after the Irish War of Independence. I have a file, which I haven't had much time to look at yet, on efforts to resettle them in fruit-picking regions of British Columbia. I know that there were, there's an article, just can't, the author's name won't come to me at the moment, in Irish Historical Studies about 20 years ago on trying to get them into Dominion police forces, where the reputation had preceded them, and they weren't all that well, very much wanted. Now, one of my Clonfin auxiliaries joined the police in Rhodesia. So he's one of the few. A few of them went into the Territorial Army. A few of them popped up in the army during the Second World War. Some of them, I don't know what the percentage is, but certainly some of them were permanently disabled. One aspect that I really would like to know more about, and I haven't really touched on it because I was running out of time there, is the Irishmen. One of my 19th Clonfin auxiliaries was a Protestant from County Laois. He was permanently disabled for the rest of his life after it. But I mean, even if he spent a small amount of time in Ireland after the war, he would have been under no illusions as to what sort of force he was joining and what he was facing into. So I want to know more about the Irishmen who joined these organizations. So Paul, I hope that gives you that there's some information there if you want to follow up.
Thanks, Maria. I think I've been unmuted. Thanks very much. I should just mention, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I was amused by your Black and Tan story with the ice cream. I've lived in the US for 32 years, and I still have to explain to my American friends that ordering a Black and Tan in a pub in Ireland is probably not a good idea. They have no idea of the history of the expression. But thanks for the note about the book. I looked that up. I'm interested in if Irish. So you said, I think, that RIC went to Palestine, and so given that there was quite a number of Irish Catholics in the RIC, then probably quite a few Irish Catholics went to Palestine.
Well, no, it's more the Tans. I was thinking of the Black Tans as an adjunct of the RIC. No, it's more the Tans who went. But that is another question of what happened to the RIC when they were disbanded, the domestic Irish RIC. And I mean, there are some reports of assaults on them during the Civil War. There are reports, things like the Irish Grants Committee, where they're looking for resettlement loans or things like that. But it seems to be the case that quite a number of them remained living in Ireland. They may have moved to different parts of the country. But what's one of the remarkable things about the Irish Free State is once the Civil War ends in 23, peace comes dropping quite fast and things settle down. And people who might have thought about leaving they stayed there, and a lot of these men stayed on, and they collected their RIC pensions. There's a big fat file in the National Archives in Ireland where the Irish government reports every so often of the death of ex-RIC, so that the British government will know not to keep paying their pension. But there's a question there of how the ex-RIC, even those who stayed until disbandment, the ordinary Irish who had joined and stayed until disbandment, where did they go? And the evidence seems to be suggest that the majority of them just stayed in Ireland and lived out to their days fairly quietly.
Thanks for this, Marie, and all your work over the commemorations. I enjoyed your interview with Portillo.
Yes, that was fun.
And it's great.
Did you notice I managed to get a nice reference into the 1997 British general election?
I did. Yes.
That was completely off the cuff. He started saying something about the majority that the Liberals had in 1906. So I just couldn't.
Yeah, you couldn't resist. Great. Well, thanks, and thanks to the host today for putting this on Zoom. Those of us in far foreign fields would not be able to attend these events without Zoom. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Paul. If anybody else has any questions, I'm going to sort of chair's privilege. And I'm just curious, there was, during the controversy last year, I seem to remember that Mary Lou McDonald, the president of Sinn Féin, posted something on social media featuring a background photo sort of from the land war as a representation of the RIC. And I was just curious, what you think, Marie, in terms of what the wider perception today of the RIC as a whole, whether actually there's any sense of an identity, that it has an identity, that it isn't actually simply about the black and tans, that it's essentially sort of, damaged by association rather than actually people knowing very much about it.
I think that is maybe one thing that the whole controversy did allow us to do, to start exploring the difference of all these organizations and to look at how the traditional domestic RIC was different. But you've hit an important point there. I remember thinking this myself at the time, going back to thinking about my school textbooks, and I have a collection. I buy these for a couple of quid in secondhand bookshops, and the ones I'd have kept from when I was at school myself. And I went back through them to see what the depiction, the visual image of the RIC, because what most Irish people will know about the RIC is what they learned in school history books. And it is exactly that, is the burly RIC man standing beside the battering ram, throwing the poor family out during the land war, or it's the TANs, or it's the Dublin Metropolitan Police baton charging people during the Lockout Bloody Sunday in Dublin in 1913. Nowhere could I find a positive picture of a nice RIC man rescuing somebody's cat from a tree. And I'm sure that they did basic, simple policing. So many Irish people had ancestors in the RIC. The famous Irish politician, Dr. Noel Brown, his father had been in the RIC, but he kept it very quiet because you didn't admit to things like that. But the representation of the RIC for so long had been negative. What did they expect people were going to how did they expect people were going to react when they had been all they had seen was a negative portrayal of the RIC for so long?
Thanks. There are a couple of questions here. So Paul Main says, is there any evidence of TANs or Auxies drifting into violent right-wing organizations in the late 20s and 30s?
Again, I'll have to defer on that one. Sean Gannon may have something on it, but I just frankly don't know enough. But it's a wonderful question, and this sense of where did they go afterwards? I've spent a lot more time, I suppose, looking at where did they come from. I've only started to look at where did they go afterwards, but certainly that is an issue with veterans generally. In continental Europe, we see veterans, First World War veterans are often the center of fascist movements. It was a major concern after the Irish Revolution with the disbandment of the revolutionary IRA and even the demobilization of the Irish National Army after the Civil War in 1923. And I've argued elsewhere that the reason those military service pensions were brought in by the Irish government for veterans was to keep them on the side, and the fear that these men could be a destabilizing force. So it's a question, my simple answer is I don't know yet. But maybe come back to me in a while and I might be able to find out, I might have found out a bit more on them for you.
Thank you. Rosie, do you want to unmute David Byrne, who has a question that I think has a bearing on
yes, I will do. I think Connell's trying to come in as well.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. It's fine. Should take the question. It'd be interesting to hear the question. I'll come in afterwards.
Okay. Sorry, I'm having some difficulty with this. Bear with me.
Sorry, Connell. I was the whole screen was actually obscured by the question window, so I didn't see.
I think we should be nice to hear the questions as well from the people. I'll come in after.
Okay, David, do you want to unmute yourself? You should be able to now.
Yeah, it's a very simple question. There's this. Oh.
I think the connection is, yeah.
David,
maybe start again, David.
Press Alt A. Try me. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yep.
Right. It's just there's this long-standing myth, which I think goes back to an episode of When the Boat Comes In, that a black and tan was assassinated on Tyne Dock Station. It was actually in an episode, and I've never been able to find any trace of that. Is there any evidence? Anybody knows about that happening?
Well, I suppose one of the my large collection of books behind me, which of course I have read, one is the Dead of the Irish Revolution, which lists all revolutionary deaths. Now I think I'm not sure if they include ones outside Ireland. Derek Gannon has a new book coming out quite soon on the revolution in England, and Gerard Noonan has a previous book. There may be something in those. Again, it would require a bit of digging in records, things like records, to see going through all the list, the deceased list, and I'm not familiar with that minute level of detail. So
I was reading the local newspapers for that period to cover industrial disputes, and I found no trace of it. But there was a very active IRA on Tyneside at that point. But I guess it is simply something that was a good storyline for a TV program.
And it may also depends on when it happened. It could have it could relate to, if it happened, it might have happened later in life when he came back to England after serving in Ireland. There's all sorts of rumors. James mentioned my one of my books on the Irish hospital sweepstakes. One of the organizers of that, Captain Spencer Freeman, whose other best buddy Joe McGrath had been a 1916 rebel and everything. It was always said that Spencer Freeman had been a black and tan, but there's absolutely no evidence of it.
Yeah, that's interesting. I just add, I mean, my sense is, if you look at the very active, absolutely IRA brigade on Tyneside, there isn't any evidence that they engage in that they target or indeed kill anybody. What they seem to target is farms, farm buildings, obviously some industrial buildings and so on. Anyway, Connell had
I think that's actually Dara. When Dara Gannon's book comes out, I think it's due out in 2022. I have a feeling he has looked at similar attacks around Liverpool and Manchester. That his view is similar. That it tends to be arson rather than personal attacks, and maybe they didn't want to draw a level of unwanted attention to themselves, which going to the next level of shooting people might have done that.
The big thing they did was fire pitwood, which was very important because they really were crippling the mining industry when they destroyed the pitwood yards.
Connell.
Thanks, David.
Thanks very much, Mary. Really interesting talk and a nice thing on a cold December evening to enjoy for people. What I wanted to ask you was, just in terms of later on in the conflict in Ireland, there's a lot of recent discussion and scholarship around intergenerational trauma, especially in the later Troubles. And I suppose what the question I wanted to ask you was, what accounts for, or could you say something a bit more about, because I'm sort of thinking about the legacy of the black and tans as well, and that feeling that sometimes lingers in the population, and it obviously kind of resonates in that way in which you were discussing with the commemoration, so-called commemoration, and the lead up to the election more in the last few years. I'm thinking in terms of cultural portrayals. I'm thinking of things like Ken Loach's The Wind That Shakes the Barley, and there is some contextualization in the Paul Laverty screenplay of that film where there's an officer says a line saying, "What do you expect? These men have fought at the Somme up to their necks in vomit and in a filthy trench," sort of thing. And what my question for you was, why? What do you think kind of accounts for why the black and tans? And because what was good about this lecture tonight was that sort of demythologization you're doing with this kind of work. Why is there still that extreme reputation that is felt within the population of Ireland? Why is it still a powerful memory whereby it's sort of passed down to generations and still conjures up feelings, even those who haven't lived through some of the brutality around them?
I suppose maybe one contrast between them and the more recent troubles that you're more familiar with is these men came from outside and they left again afterwards. So you're not there still looking at them every day as your everyday lives. So maybe that removes a level of, there might have been a level, if they were still part of the same community, shall we say, it might have dumbed down, or people might have wanted to forget. So it's easy enough to maybe in some ways they're an easy target for all the wrongs of British rule in Ireland, and maybe it was easier to focus on them rather than to focus on the divisions during the Civil War. That's just I suppose one possible end of it. I think I mentioned the portrayal of the police in the school textbooks. I think we would need to go back to things like how these police forces were dealt with in school textbooks. That is where a lot of people will have got their knowledge of it from. You're including another question there about kind of trauma in the personal aspect of these men themselves and their experience of trauma, and maybe their own family's experience of trauma when they came home. And certainly I think Andrew Nelson's research, which James will be familiar with, has identified using war records some men who quite clearly were absolutely unfit ever to have been brought into the auxiliaries. And certainly one of my 19 auxiliaries was medically discharged from the army because of his experience as a prisoner of war in Germany during the First World War. There's absolutely no way that man was medically fit to be brought into the auxiliaries. So there's a question about how suitable they were in the first place. And then a number of mine, certainly the ones who survived, did have did suffer what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder afterwards. So that's a whole area that needs to be looked at. There's not very many of them were married at the time. Harold Clayton is unusual. I've also come across another man who's in the black and tans end of it. And I just came purely going through records. You go through records and you find anything. I was looking for somehow the legal court records from Longford for this period exist. And I was actually looking for something so totally different. I was looking for Irish people claiming compensation for attacks during the Civil War. And I just found this legal document related to what were known as the Booth miners. What's this about? Leonard Booth was a black and tan constable who was shot dead in Longford in 1921, close to the end of the War of Independence. And he was married with 3 children. The compensation paid to his family was held in trust for that family by the Irish state until those children each reached the age of majority in the late 30s and early 40s. So you've all this correspondence back and forth between these children of a black and tan, these children living in England, whose father apparently had deserted the family and everything. It's a fascinating story. But they were writing to the district court in Longford in 1938 saying, I'm 21 now, can I have my money, please? So I'm not sure quite what to do with that story yet, but it's the British side of the black and tans. You ask what the Irish think of the black and tans. I want to know, I'd love to know more about families who had men who served in these forces. And did they even know, or did they come back to England? Did Harold Clayton's son and daughter, did they ever know much about what happened to their father? Did they just sort of put it out of their mind? It's a fascinating, it's a whole side. We don't know enough about these forces.
Conal's point raises a really interesting point, which made me think about how, the relative sort of balance when we think about the Crown forces, and you briefly touched upon the presence of the army, who were there, in Ireland in significantly enhanced numbers compared to the sort of 19th century, early 20th century establishment, and yet the army are often sort of almost invisible during the kind of the War of Independence, or there's a sort of feeling of that, unlike 1916 in Dublin, the emphasis in terms of Crown forces that we have is very much on the sort of paramilitary police forces that are created, yet the army are there in significant numbers.
I think rarely did the IRA want to engage the RIC made sense. They were the local. They wanted to get them out. They wanted to neutralize them as a source of intelligence. They wanted to get their guns. The TANs and auxiliaries were brought in specifically to deal with them. The army tended to keep its distance, and the IRA tended to keep their distance from the army as well. The army's used more by the spring and summer of 1920 to conduct these major roundups, these sweeps of the country and lifting Republican suspects. So I think I see it with Macready as well. Neville Macready doesn't want his army associated with these things, these nasty black and tans are doing. So I think there's a bit of a kind of the army keeping its distance, and likewise the IRA knowing that the army, it's all right to go out and ambush the tans. We're not going to stir that hornet's nest.
Are there any further questions? Rosie, did you?
Yes, there's one more question from Paul Main. But before we move to him, there's also a very interesting description in the chat of somebody who in 1969 walks into a pub in Ireland, around Galway from the looks of it, and asks for a black and tan. Apparently they got rescued by the barman, who was pretty nice to them about it. So memory lingers. Paul, I'm going to unmute you if you'd like to ask your question.
Question's already been asked. It was about evidence of TANs and auxiliaries actually drifting into right-wing or violent organisations. That was already dealt with. Thank you.
They go into all sorts of places. I mean, the Irish ones are the ones who interest me. There's quite a well-known one called Tynan O'Mahony. And he was related to Catherine Tynan James, whose work you've probably come across during the relating to the First World War. They're a very well off, upper middle class Catholic family. And Gerard Tynan O'Mahony, that was his name. When he left the auxiliaries, he went back. He worked as a sub-editor of the Irish Times. He was very well known, and this will be before my time. His son, I believe, was a well-known comedian called Dave Allen. That might mean something to some people who are slightly older than I am. That fact that you could be Irish, you could have served in these awful forces, and yet you could still go back into living a normal life in Ireland afterwards. And that fascinates me. And even the joining up, looking at the RIC registers, which are online. If you look at any from January 1920, you can pretty much assume anyone joining the RIC after January 1920 can be categorized as black and tan. There's still a lot of Irish Catholics joining after 1920, and they know what they're joining. So that's a fascinating question to probe in a bit more detail.
Barry, can I ask you a quick, just nip in with a cheeky question for you, which is, in terms of the 20s and in terms of the files, and you were mentioning your work with the Centenary Committee, and then again doing some quite interesting and useful work around that. Do you think there's a chance we're going to see? Is there any chance we're going to see any of those files?
I think that has been one of the priorities of our committee, and in some ways, while the overall Northern Ireland Centenary has been distracted by the big non-events like Michael D and the Armagh service, it has allowed us to beaver away in the background on the boring stuff. And we had a meeting recently, and there was some word came through from Prony that, this stuff is really boring. It's only personnel lists and lists of names, and the historians all, but that's really interesting stuff. So yeah, no, they have. My sense is that they are working away. The biggest problem, of course, as you will know very well, Prony is woefully under-resourced. So we did try a Zoom meeting like this with the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland to really press on him the importance of this. And so I don't know what will come of it, but yes, no. Overall answer is yes. Work has been going on all year with Prony to try and do that. they have been releasing stuff just gradually without making a big song and dance about it. So it is well worth, if you can navigate the Prony catalogue, which I find is horrendously difficult to navigate. If you can dig in there, there's quite a lot of stuff open already. But yes, they are planning to have a lot of that stuff open. So that's your summer holidays looked after.
Here, I can't wait.
You might even get in more than they really only open to researchers on a Monday by appointment at the moment. So it's one of the serious downsides of COVID is the restriction of access to archival institutions.
As Rosie pointed out, there's been some interesting discussion in the chat, both around Black and Tan, the drink, but also some local and family sort of stories and anecdotes. So I think that Marie, your point earlier on about sort of obviously looking in more detail at who the Black and Tans and the Augsies were, but also the kind of the legacies. And I think you touched upon that a little bit with that Longford case stretching into the interwar period, and the legacies not only in terms of other police forces around the British Empire, but at home as well, would be well worth following up. So we're going to close now by saying many thanks to Marie for a really interesting and accessible overview. Thanks for everybody for coming along and asking such interesting questions. Thanks as ever to the Tyneside Irish Centre for hosting this really interesting sort of talk and discussion. And if it's not too early, I guess it's an opportunity to wish everybody a happy Christmas when it comes. Thanks to Rosie as well.
Yes, thank you very much, and I look forward to finally getting to Newcastle in person and
soon, hopefully.
You'll be very welcome. Okay.
Okay.
Thanks,
Many thanks.
Night,
Thanks
everyone.
very much.
Thanks, Paul.
Good night.